Afternoon and welcome to today's evidence session, our second session on Freeports. It's also Gibraltar National Day, so we extend warm greetings to friends in Gibraltar, particularly affected, I think, by Brexit and all these changes. And doubtless I'm interested in Freeports and are probably eschewing the pleasures of National Day today to be tuning in to our committee hearing on Freeports. I've no doubt this is the case. We've got two panels today. Unfortunately, our second panel, we expected and hoped to have Lars Carlson, Managing Director of KGH Global Consulting, but he's had to pull out at the last minute for understandable personal reasons. So we will have a smaller second panel, and the first panel is Richard Ballantyne, Councillor Kevin Bentley, and Andrew Carter. I will let each of them introduce themselves on their own terms, the usual name, rank, and serial number, starting with Richard Ballantyne.
Well, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you, Chair. My name is Richard Ballantyne, Chief Executive of the British Ports Association.
Thank you very much. Councillor Kevin Bentley.
Thank you, members. Thank you, Chair. Yes, I'm Councillor Kevin Bentley. I am the Chair of the LGA's People and Places Board, but also the Chair of the Brexit Task Force, working with the government, and in the day job, I'm the Deputy Leader of Essex County Council.
And I think we've met before at a hearing previously.
We have, yes.
Good to develop a acquaintance again, or to keep acquaintances going. Andrew Carter.
Hi, Chair. I'm Andrew Carter. I'm the Chief Executive of the Centre for Cities.
Thank you all very much, and thank you for coming this afternoon to what is quite an interesting area in the era of Brexit, which is Freeport. Can I ask Richard Ballantyne initially, but I'll maybe spread the question afterwards. And of course, if I can just remind people to keep their microphones closed when they're not speaking, but do please, easier said than done, open your microphones when you start to speak. Richard Ballantyne, in your view, how comprehensive is the package of measures proposed by the government's consultation on Freeports, and are there any areas that require further development?
Well, thank you, Chair. First of all, I'd just like to say, as a National Ports Association, it won't surprise you to say that we're very excited and interested in these proposals. I think it's fair to say we've been pushing for sort of similar changes to UK ports policy for a number of years. So we're delighted to see the vision being taken forward in the way it has. Now, when we got the consultation, of course, the main thing that we were slightly miffed at is the number 10, the arbitrary figure of 10 free ports. So I have to say that you might find that's a reoccurring theme that I come back to each time. But if we park that for a minute, and we'll come back to that later and think about competition and regional displacement, etc. I think the consultation and your questions about the proposals in there, I think it's pretty comprehensive. It's not perhaps quite complete, but it's a very good overview, and it's not just the original concept of a traditional free ports, which is around customs easements and tariff suspension, etc. This is much broader. This is to do with planning, enterprise stimulus, other things to attract growth and investment to regional coastal areas. The one probably big area we see is missing is marine planning. So there's quite a lot about landside planning, which is all very welcome and looks very positive, and hopefully will be rolled out further than just the free ports. But marine planning in the last decade or so has become increasingly challenging for ports and harbours of all type and size in all parts of the UK. And Mr. Chairman, you will know Stornoway Port Authority very well. You know, they have to deal with similar challenges, just as larger ports, international cargo handling ports up and down the country have to. So we would appreciate the Freeports vision, notwithstanding that limitation of 10, perhaps embracing some of the planning frustrations in the marine environment.
Yeah, you'll probably know Alec MacLeod quite well at the Ports Authority. Can I just ask, before we move to other witnesses, how do you see this Freeports proposal being different to the situation which led to the demise or the wilting on the vine, if you like, of the Freeports in 2012?
Yeah, it's a good question. So the previous free ports were actually more around the customs easements and VAT and taxation, etc. Whereas this proposal now, subject to what the government decides to do following its consultation, is now looking at a much broader suite of business and regulatory easements that would effectively create zones of development and investment and enterprise and growth, hopefully. So we're looking at planning easements as one I've already mentioned, but also as enterprise zone stimulus. So lower business rates for startups, plugging them into local and regional transport plans, and also things like taxation rules, looking at capital allowances so that we can stimulate and encourage investment in infrastructure. So it is a lot broader than just the traditional customs Freeport that we had previously.
Thank you very much. Kevin Bentley, do you see any areas that require further development in this, or any areas of concern?
So, rather like Richard, obviously in local government we welcome Freeports because they can be a stimulus to economic growth as well. But it's important, of course, that we in local government are equal partners in this because we're actually on the ground working with our ports authorities. I would also say as well, around the regulatory services, they are supplied by local government, either trading standards or environmental health officers. We need to make sure that those standards are maintained and our staff either need to be increased or need to be heavily involved in any work that's going on in Freeport. And also around regeneration as well. So Freeports could offer a very good stimulus for regeneration in many of our areas. But it's critically important that local government is involved in that. And this shouldn't be seen as something being done to an area. While we understand the pace and the importance of this, local government is a critical partner in many things, but in this particular, it's very, very important. So we'd like to make sure we are involved, and those port authorities are involved along with their local councils at either tiers or none, depending on where they are, and also making sure the planning regulations, as you heard before from Richard, are slightly different because the impact on the environment. So while it's good that Freeport's being established, what is the onward effect on that? Can the road networks cope, certainly those that local governments are involved in and responsible for? So we need a much wider conversation around this. So this is not to be destructive, it's meant to be constructive around this because we want them to be successful, we want them to work very well, but it's something that shouldn't happen around us, it should happen with us, and that's actually taking quite a lead in that as well. And I would also echo what Richard said, why just 10? Other ports are available.
Thank you. Andrew Carter, you've been waiting patiently there. Would you like to contribute?
Well, I think as the other witnesses have said, there seems to be a sort of comprehensive element to it. I suppose I would hone in on and focus on the questions around local impact and particularly the regeneration aspects that are aspired to through the scheme. We'll probably get into that in a bit more detail. And for certain, if we are to make good on some of those aspirations and objectives, then I do think the questions and issues associated with the skills of the locality and the degree to which they match and meet what is required in those free ports is going to be particularly important. And whilst it's alluded to, I think, in the consultation, I think to get anywhere near some of those objectives and aspirations, a much greater focus and emphasis on those kind of issues is going to be need to be given.
Thank you very much. Now turning to Craig Williams. Craig Williams, I'm sure he's ready with his.
Thanks, Chair.
Yep.
Yeah. I wonder whether we could do the reverse order. So if we start with Andrew, and could I ask, the UK Major Ports group has said that the bidding process must be fair, transparent, evidence-based. We'd all say that and expect it. But I wondered whether you could drill into how you want the government to ensure that, or what you'll be looking for to evidence that process.
Well, to be honest with you, Mr. Williams, that's not an area that I'm spending a lot of time kind of thinking about. So you might have done a disservice in going in reverse order. But other than, the points that you make, I think being very clear about what it is that it's trying to achieve and the realism associated with that achievement. Again, we can come on to that, particularly if we start talking about the impact of enterprise zones in reality rather than in rhetorical terms. So I think a reality about what it is that they're trying to achieve, and I suppose the trade-offs that they are willing or prepared to make. For example, there is likely to be a trade-off, we don't know how significant it is, between the sort of local regeneration effects that you may be looking for, the leveling up effects that you may be looking for, and the kind of trade maximisation or growth maximisation. I'm not saying they are mutually exclusive, but we would expect to be alive to some of those sorts of issues when we're making decisions, and you would want the process to be rehearsing those and sharing those and providing that so we can understand how we come to those kind of decisions. So that would be my my observation on that. But it's not an area, as I said, that we spend an awful lot of time looking at.
So what kind of flexibility would you be looking for between the type of freeport or even the geography, region, nation?
Well, I think again, is 10 the right number? I don't know. I don't think every port is the right answer, and I can understand why those in the industry would want that to be the case. I think there is going to be some need for selection. But then I think, if you're weighted towards this as a mechanism for local regeneration, then I would expect to see some geographical weighting or some geographical criteria that says I'm preferencing places in X and Y rather than in A or B. So, that's the kind of thing that I would want to see. But I would want to see that at the outset rather than having to try to work that out once I've seen the decisions that have been made, which is typically, or not typically, which is occasionally what we see happen, which is we look at the results and then we're trying to work out what it is that the government was trying to achieve. So the more we can be explicit at the outset, the better it is that we can be transparent and actually then inform some of the decisions that have already been touched on.
And just before we bring Kevin and Richard in, so you mentioned the weighting. What kind of criteria, if you're starting now, what kind of weighting would you be doing to evaluate within the criteria of the Freeport?
Well, yes, and so you're definitely at the boundaries of my, my area. So I tread very carefully, not least because it's on record. But I would be thinking about, the degree to which, for example, there's an aspiration for these places to be more than just simply ports. We've heard that already. Innovation, high-skilled growth. I'd be looking there, for example, for some criteria that allows me to understand which of the places already have some of those attributes that we can build on, because what we do know in the evidence is that in the absence of those assets there already, they are very, very difficult to build from scratch. So that would be one area that if that is a true aspiration, then that would lead you to think about certain criteria in and around existing assets, existing strengths, existing networks in the innovation type spaces that I would be looking for. And then again, because I suppose I'm primarily interested in this context around the regen and the kind of local growth issues, I would be looking for some sort of commentary in the submissions about how the locality is going to benefit through, for example, apprenticeship programs and skills development programs that are very particularly targeted at the local communities that they are in, rather than essentially be places where, as growth occurs, it's taken by outsiders, which is inevitable going to happen. But we can make more interventions that can limit the degree to which the benefits accrue to those that are not currently there, although we will probably see some composition change as a result of that. Yes, and I'm not going to go any further on that, Mr. Williams, so please don't press me again.
Don't say we didn't ask. Kevin.
Well, so just picking on that last point, I don't think it needs to be inevitable that other people come in. We have great opportunities with skills, and younger people and older people come to that looking for new careers. What we must do, I think, is work with not just the local authorities, but the local colleges as well, as to what skills are going to be required. And I think that's something where the local workforces can very quickly be part of that regeneration. I come back to my point, of course, in my experiences, a lot of ports, I haven't been to every one of them, but I've been to a lot of them, they function very well. It's what happens outside the port gates that becomes important, and on the infrastructures. There's no point bringing all this cargo in if it can't move anywhere. So that's why, again, working with Highways England and working with the local authority, do we need to enhance any of that infrastructure? Hopefully a lot of it will go on trains, but what is the knock-on effect on the train services for passengers as well? So I think that conversation is a wider conversation than just the Freeport itself, but it's very important. That does involve all of us across the piece, and certainly local government. Certainly I run highways in Essex, and therefore I would expect to have that conversation if it involved ports in my area, not just my county, but my area. So whether it be Felixstowe or DP World or Harwich, and my counterparts around the country in the same place, are all going to use our roads. It's how that is going to function, and making sure the cargo can get through securely.
And Richard?
Well, at risk of trying to squirm out the question, as a national representative, it's quite difficult to actually talk about a bidding process that may benefit one of my members or others over others. But I'd say, other than saying that it should just be for seaports and we can ignore airports, etc., I can't really do that. But what I would say, it's probably more a question for the government and those in charge of tasked with regional and economic development and investment, because they're probably better placed to decide that. Now, the problem with having 10 is you increase the stakes here somewhat. So I think coming back to your original point about the actual bidding process, it absolutely has to be fair. We have to do away with politics, unfortunately. We have to, park any kind of potential allegiances that certain politicians have to certain regions, which may be difficult for some to swallow. And also, I'd say let's not be limiting ourselves by looking at various areas with, without imagination. You need to think about how we'd link up digitally to other regions as well as physically. You need to look at what land availability is, both available at the port, but also in close proximity, not necessarily owned by the port or part of their port estate. So I think it's, sorry if I can't give you a direct question, but it's got to be, obviously, I would say, it's got to be fair. And one little final point I'd say is, with 10, you will pick winners, and that means there will be losers, of course. And I think the process has got to be watertight, because you may find one or two regions, operators, politicians in areas, they may look to challenge government after the event just to make sure that they've had a fair hearing.
Mm. Well, I'm going to push back a little bit on the criteria, and you want the process to be fair. So if you were setting the criteria, what do you expect from that? How would you, if you were the government right now, what would you want in terms of that criteria?
I think there were some statements made previously about the north particularly needing to benefit, the north of England. And absolutely, there'll be some very deserving locations and suitable points where we could look at Freeports there. But I think we wouldn't want to just limit it there. There is deprivation across the country, whether in north, south, in all parts of the UK. So I wouldn't limit it there. Also, politics comes in somewhat when you think about the 4 nations of the UK and potentially that 10. You quickly use up that 10 if you go around the coast and you think politically there will be at least, we would imagine, one in Wales, one in Northern Ireland, maybe more, and the same for Scotland. And then airports, seaports, there's a long queue, so to speak. So it's got to be fair, and therefore we can't just limit it based on a geographical description. I think the actual deprivation, the need, the infrastructure, the land, I think they all have to be thrown into the mix.
Thanks, Chap.
Thank you very much. Just a quick question before I go to Paul Girvan. The Freeports, and if the UK government follows a low tariff policy, will this make it Freeports more or less likely to succeed or more difficult? Or, I mean, there must be some sort of thought with the tariff background the Freeports will be operating in. Because Freeports tend to operate well where there are tariff walls to get round and beat.
Yes, is that for me, Chairman, do you think?
Yeah, sorry, Richard, yeah.
Yes. Absolutely, if we had a free trade deal for the EU or we had free trade deals with other countries, the customs element of a free port would be less beneficial, I would say, but not completely unusable. There's a lot of bureaucracy around customs as well. You can suspend various other payments and paperwork processes, so they certainly would still be beneficial. But coming back to the earlier points, this is a package that isn't just customs related. This relates to planning, easements, this relates to enterprise zone stimulus, possible grants for skills, for capital allowances, etc. So that full package would be largely unaffected by a future trade deal. Okay, thank you. And before I go to Paul Given, I'll have to keep on pause a little longer. Martin Vickers did intimate earlier that he wanted to come in around this area. So, Mr. Vickers.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Richard mentioned the links between seaports and airports and so on. Do you think the criteria should actually look more widely than just based on the seaports, and actually the links that they have with rail hubs, local regional airports and the like?
Yes, hi Martin. Yeah, thank you. I think I agree absolutely. But to be fair to government, although they haven't nailed their colours to the mast yet, I think they've indicated this in the consultation. It's a rather large consultation document that they had open for the first part of this year, and effectively they haven't ruled out those links. Now, whether you need some kind of physical boundary, I think is yet to be agreed, because that a red line on a map may or may not be practical or workable. But virtually, this is another thing that I suppose we can say we've moved on from the previous Freeports model. We have technological advances, inventory advances, digital possibilities and capabilities where you could link up sites to the ports and the airport locations. And I do think there will be, subject to the government's bidding process, I do think there will be some joint bids between seaports and airports within the same region, because there's a lot of complementary attributes there, and in terms of a regional development strategy, there's a lot in common.
Thank you. Sorry, Andrew Carter, you want to come in just on that? I see that your hand up.
Well, very briefly, Chair. I think ultimately we need to think about, in a sense, the danger is essentially what we're claiming for these sorts of areas. Essentially, we should claim for pretty much the whole of the country, and therefore the whole of the country should be a free port as defined in some way, in a sense of the way that we define it. And so, by very definition, these
Before
are...
you're back, Stephen, I'm still on.
Sorry, your microphone. Yep.
These are, by definition, these are area-based type interventions. We have to think of them in that way. And therefore, boundaries will need to be set to a degree. And there will be a need to be, some degree of selection and prioritization, whether it's 10 or 20 or, 5 or 1. I think otherwise we're in danger of, particularly if we start to actually say that it's not really the port bit that we're interested in, it's all the innovation, and we want these places to be high knowledge, business dynamic places. Well, if you go to every place in the country, they'll tell you that they want exactly the same sorts of ambitions and aspirations, whether they've got a port or not. So the centrality of the port as their thing, or the airport as a thing, the more you move away from that, then in a sense, the less you become distinguished from other parts of the country, and more difficult it becomes to understand what the policy actually is.
So, are some people looking for this, not so much for the Freeport idea, but just as an idea of leveraging in cash and assistance into the local area? Would you say that, Andrew? Or maybe
if you hold the port sort of element constant, most places in the country would say to you that they're looking for extra investment into their place. They're looking for extra infrastructure investment to open up transport, roads or rail. They want to create conditions where they can attract more high-skilled businesses and be innovation hotbeds. Not every place, but many places up and down the country, large, small, coastal, inland, etc., will talk to you about the similar things. So the question then becomes, what is it that we're actually talking about in relation to Freeports if we're not really talking about the port? And once you introduce the port element, then you have to be mindful that that in itself creates a set of parameters about what can or cannot be achieved.
So in investment-starved areas are basically looking at this only chance of getting a carrot from the government. Will sing the song of Freeports just to get what they particularly need and have needed for a number of decades, perhaps.
I can't comment on the kind of individual motivations of individual places, but I would suspect that there is an element that money is on the table, or cash is on the table, cash is in short supply from other places. This might be an avenue by which I could explore getting more, more cash into my place, which, by the way, is entirely rational from every, from particular place's point of view.
Absolutely, yeah. and Freeports is neither here nor there for them. For maybe. Paul Girvan, you've been patience personified. The floor is yours, sir.
Thank you, Chair. Thank the panel. This is really initially to the whole panel, but probably ask Kevin to kick off. In your view, can Freeports fulfil the government's objectives to become national hubs for global trade and investment across the UK?
So I would say yes, because anything is possible, isn't it? But what is important also is it's national, global and local, because a lot of the supply, of course, of workforce, skills, and also getting goods to and from will come through the local areas. So I think it's critically important that the local area needs to benefit through the regeneration we've spoken about before, and of course be global players themselves in that. So parts of the UK and parts of England and parts of Wales, Northern Ireland and Scotland can also play a part in that success. So I would say yes, absolutely, they can be a global player in this. Again, we've come back to the number, and I know Richard's mentioned that many times, I'll mention it as well. Why 10? I don't know. I think it's more. And I would just say within this as well, that we haven't, and we mustn't forget the secondary ports that have been announced. So there'll be the free ports, there'll be the main ports, then there'll be the secondary ports. I think we should spend some time thinking about that, because if our ports become amazingly busy for whatever reasons, and we need to revert to the secondary ports, we mustn't find ourselves caught out by the fact that they're not geared up with the help they need on infrastructure and skills as well.
Richard?
Yeah, thanks. I think the one thing that the ports industry in the UK is fairly unique for is it's independent of government and strategically and financially independent, and it's not used to any interventions typically. It's used to doing its own thing, attracting investment either from investors or using its own capital. And I think the drive here will be very much around port-related commodities activities, and not just trade. Trade, very important, absolutely. Our international gateways, 95% of our trade is brought in and departs the country via sea. So it is essential, but I would say it's more broad than that. We've got lots of people supporting the offshore oil and gas and renewable energy industries. There's leisure and tourism. Hopefully once coronavirus, we get through this, we'll get back to things like ferry and cruise travel being abundant, etc. So I would say it's more than just trade, but absolutely, I think Freeports can help the government realise its vision. I come back to the 10 again. I think why limit your ambition? I think the government, it's probably fair to say, might be a bit nervous of loss of revenue through having a traditional customs-related free port where it lose the tariff income it generates. But I don't think most UK ports are really, that's not one of the fundamental points of the latest Freeports proposal they're interested in. I think particularly the planning easements, whether that be landside or hopefully some marine support and other things, plugging into local and national transport strategies, and perhaps also some taxation benefits in terms of short term at least on things like business rates. I don't think that will have the impact potentially that the government is so nervous about. So the 10, we would say, why limit your ambition? Let's go for more.
Yeah, and Andrew?
I don't really have an answer to that question. I suppose not least because I don't personally know where our ports currently rank in the global system. And my sense would be, that would be my starting point, and then questions about how significant are the constraints on our existing ports to allow them to do more than they are currently doing, and how does that weigh into what's going on across the globe in other obviously in other systems where ports of different types are also thinking about how they can expand as well.
Yeah. And thanks for your answer so far, but everybody says all politics is local, and very much that is the case. How can the government ensure that the benefits of increased trade and investment are spread evenly, including amongst areas that are not chosen for free ports?
So because I think about making sure. So economic recovery is hugely important, especially right now, but it's very important with Brexit too. We have a good global economy, but that shouldn't disenfranchise any part of the United Kingdom. It shouldn't disenfranchise the ability for economies to grow, and everyone should benefit from them. So they may be in a certain place, and that is important. We've discussed that. What's important is how that wealth then spreads out. And that's why I think it's hugely important that councils, with where they operate, especially through the sub-regional transport boards that we have, and I chair one of them in Transport East, and I was still a colleague, and we've discussed this very subject actually. It is very important that all parts of the UK benefit from this, and it's very important that we can all get a share of what comes through the free ports. So I don't think we should just concentrate just on the geography. While clearly they are in one place, it is about how that wealth is then spread around and dispersed as well. That will come through cargo that moved around, through the skills that are as well, and through the training processes. So I think it's about looking at it across the United Kingdom on this, while dealing in these 10 areas. And then, of course, the other ports we're operating and those secondary ports as well. It's about having a continued conversation, I think, about this. I don't think necessarily it's one conversation and then it's over. It's about development of these ports in the future and how they're going to benefit not just their local communities, but also a wider community on a regional basis.
Thank you. Thank you. Richard, have you anything to comment on that?
Yeah, I think going back to the point I made about competition, it's quite important here to understand that a kind of non-managed port sector, although it is regulated, of course, but not non-strategically managed, in that ports can make their own investment decisions subject to market conditions and lenders, etc. I think we need to be wary that we need to allow that to continue, because that has helped the industry in terms of competition. It's also helped customers and shipping companies coming through. That competition has kept prices low. We have lots of ports in the UK, lots of cargo handling ports and others, unlike other areas around the world where perhaps you get more concentrated port activities. For example, in Europe, you have Rotterdam as a big hub of activity there, and great for them. But if you were to draw away investment and business opportunities from certain regions into one clustered organisation in the UK, I think you would quickly find some regional division. So I think that kind of keeping that competition element there is absolutely essential, and that's why broadening it out to more than just the 10 would be helpful. Now, that said, if the government was absolutely wedded to that number 10, we could definitely look at broadening out some of the benefits that are highlighted in the recent consultation process, such as the planning easements. So I'll give you an example there. Things like the permitted development rights, where a port authority has the planning authority to build certain structures up to a certain threshold, which is defined in law. They enable ports to act in a very agile and responsive way. So, for example, if there was a new offshore renewables development coming up, then we would want UK ports to be best placed to respond to a offshore energy developer's aims to anchor a lot of the activity in the UK. And it's not just about competing in the UK, we're competing against European ports, very internationally. So we want to make sure things like offshore renewables is centred in the UK and not necessarily in Scandinavia or continental Europe.
Thank you.
So I'm going to assume that you're not meaning benefits spread equally, for example, through the tax system. So, for example, if someone does better, it pays more revenue in, and therefore we have more money in theory to redistribute as we saw fit. I assume that you're not making, not asking that question.
That's exactly right.
So my response would be, there isn't any sense, in a sense, the very design of the scheme where you're selecting particular places, you're actually trying to differentiate between one place and another. Otherwise, the very system doesn't work. I mean, it has to work by saying, in this place you get X, but if you're not in this place, you don't get X. So, you have to set up the uneven playing field. Otherwise, what is the purpose of the intervention? So, the idea that the benefits then magically ripple out broadly, I think is actually not proven. We did the work looking at the enterprise zones. Yes, they are different, but there are lots and lots of similarities. And actually, the scale of effects was nowhere near what we were told that they would have in terms of government figures at the outset. Less than a third of the jobs promised have actually been created. And then a third of those jobs essentially came from within the patch of the enterprise zone itself, and essentially jobs hopping from one part of the sub-region into the enterprise zone itself. So in a sense, the worry, and this is the downside with any area-based interventions, is that essentially they create boundaries where firms and or workers are essentially hopping from one place to another to take advantage of whatever the opportunities are there on offer. And then my final point would be, and again, it's not because they have ports, but it is an obvious truth that some of our poorest communities are port communities. So there's a question there where the mechanism that we think may work is not currently working. That's for sure, right? And there's a sort of an effect. It's not because, port places are not poor because they have ports, but they are poor nevertheless. So this kind of assumption that it will ripple out or the benefits will be more widely felt, unfortunately, in the evidence is not forthcoming at all, not only from this country, but actually internationally, which is why I think we have to tread very carefully about the size and scale of the types of interventions that we're proposing. And once you get into a point where you're actually not really proposing significant differences between place X and place Y, then essentially, you're into a flat level playing field, and we're back to where I was earlier on, which is apply these things everywhere. Not that I would do that, but apply these things to every place.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Paul Given. Turning now to Matt Western. Matt, I think you're ready, poised to go.
Thank you. I know, Richard, you wanted to come in on that. I think I saw your hand come up on that previous point. But perhaps you can add in your comments to what I'm just about to concentrate on, which is really job creation. And following up really, I guess, on the points that Andrew Carter was just making. I mean, we've had various previous meetings in this inquiry, and you hear numbers being quoted, some pretty big telephone numbers, but from other accounts, the numbers might be more like 1930s telephone numbers, considerably smaller. The nub of my question is, what is realistic in these proposals? And Richard, just to start with you, as you wanted to raise a point just a moment ago.
Yeah, well, again, I haven't got I haven't got a number, unfortunately, a figure of potential. There has been various studies done both regionally and nationally, where I'm sure the committee could seek some more detailed evidence on this. But I think what I was going to say when I come back to Andrew's point previously, which is still relevant to your question, Mr. Weston, is that we're not just talking about sort of limiting just to one region or competing within the UK. We're competing against countries and ports outside the UK. We want to get that business, and it could be very international business, offshore energy, etc. So we want to have a better offer to make sure that our port regions, in my case, are well prepared. So it's not, as I say, not just about competing intra-UK with regions.
Okay. Just really, there are comments really about sort of where the value might be in these port opportunities. And a question would be about sort of where the high value jobs might come from, and what opportunities there are in trade-in services. Could you just elaborate on those? And again, start with you, Richard.
I think if you look at our ports industry in the UK, in recent generations, and coming back to the previous point about port regions being poor, a lot of the activity and trade around and going through our ports is actually going through them. So our ports are quite often gateways to trade, and not necessarily the big sort of manufacturing hubs like you get in places like Rotterdam, where you have on-site added value processes in connection to the port. So quite often our goods are coming in, we're an import-driven economy, and they're being transported to distribution centres, manufacturing facilities, shops, etc. And I think the point about having a zone around a port where you can create a more business-friendly environment is about encouraging the growth of new manufacturing opportunities or added value processes, which we haven't necessarily already had. So if you can create that stimulus, then we're attracting new things particularly. We're not talking about necessarily displacement from, so for example, the Midlands or somewhere. This is about new investment and opportunities. And in the post-Brexit era, I think the government is looking at how, there's going to be changes to freight flows and our trade. So they're looking at ways, I would argue, that makes us the most attractive for inward investment and for new developments and activity in quite often deprived areas.
But how would you stop displacement? Because that's
by not having.
Isn't that what would happen?
Well, if you don't have the cap of 10, that's the starting point. Then you're not sort of creating an exclusive area that other parts of the UK would be automatically aware of. Now we're talking very much about new investment here. I think. I mean, there may be some relocation of facilities that are coming to the end of life for their plant or equipment, etc. But I think broadly speaking, we're looking at new investment. It will be difficult to see major manufacturing hubs up sticks and relocate to the coast if they're, say, in the Midlands, because that would be hugely expensive for them to do. But I think you'd have to ask that sector.
Kevin, can I come to you?
Yes, so I think in terms of displacement, I mentioned earlier, that's if you see them just in geographic isolation. If you work in more of a pan-regional basis, I think that starts to change the argument. So through the sub-regional transport boards, for instance, combined authorities, that's where you start to see the value of those. If they're to be part of that economy, not just the immediate economy, and I think you can stop the displacement. I just want to introduce just
sorry, Kevin, it was a very poor line, certainly for me. I didn't quite hear what you just said.
I'll just repeat it then. So I mentioned earlier that displacement happens if they're just seen geographically as opportunities where they are. I think if you operate on a more pan-regional basis, with the sub-regional transport boards, but also with combined authorities and other local authorities as well in those areas, then there seems global pan-regional economy. Not certainly just from the local point of view, clearly there's an international global element to this, but from the local point of view, that's when I think you can start to see some benefits and not have that displacement.
So it wouldn't just be sheds with high-value luxury items being stored or anything like that. It would actually be.
Well, I don't think that needs to be that. I think it's about onward cargo as well and where it goes and how that helps and feeds into the local supply chain and the economy. What I would introduce as well, for me, just quickly, one element, and something we haven't talked about, but the LG's done a huge amount of work of, is the green energy economy that I think is going to really take off, not just in the UK but around the world. But certainly we'll have to play a factor in that. We can operate through the ports through that as well. So not just wind farm technology, but also solar technology. This is going to really take off, and there's an opportunity for our ports here, an opportunity for skills there as well.
Okay, Andrew.
Yeah, so a couple of thoughts. I suppose, one way to think about it, to minimise displacement from within the UK, you can't eradicate it. So anybody that tells you can is being slightly less than honest. There will, by definition, have to be an element of displacement in the very functioning and style design of the scheme. So, but in order to minimise it, as Richard said, you have to be very, very focused and clear on the degree to which you can identify new rather than existing. You'd also probably need to think about, in reality, to minimise UK displacement, let's imagine that our ports here are essentially taking market share from ports elsewhere in the world. That would be in a sense, it would be additional to this country, but a loss to those countries. And that's so that you minimise displacement there. My other thought, which is actually based, the only thing I can say to you on the enterprise zone analysis work that we've done and others have done, gives us some rule of thumb in terms of the numbers. And what we know, so firstly, there is a rule of thumb amongst appraisers of bids around jobs, particularly employment growth, is that we automatically discount about 40% of the number that's given to us. And we just know that is essentially optimism bias that is put into those kind of bids. So you work from a basis that whatever the number is given to you, or the number, 40% reduction probably gets you somewheres towards some sense of the upper bound. So that's the first thing in terms of overall numbers. That's where I would work, and lots of other appraisers and evaluators do something very similar. When we look at the job numbers for the enterprise zones, the more recent ones, so from 2011 through to 2017 when we did the analysis, they were promised to make 54,000 jobs, new jobs, not just any job. The actual number was 17,000, so that's a significant reduction. Some of those were temporary and public sector. So in the private sector, that's 13,000 jobs, give or take. About a third of those jobs were essentially pure displacement, either from actually within the very locality in which the enterprise zone was set, or pretty much close to it. And another third were existing firms somewhere else in the country establishing new branches in the enterprise zone. Now, we don't know whether that's genuinely new or whether they're taking advantage of that. So that leaves you with, give or take, about 30% of those, that quite reduced number, that is genuinely additional to the particular scheme or the scheme itself, and then that gets distributed across different enterprise zones. So, I'm not saying that would happen for Freeports. I've no idea, but that would be my starting basis in just thinking about the magnitude and type of activity, and of course, opportunities for global expansion, new technology and new industries. All of that is unknown, but it's unknown to everybody. So there'll be kind of, opportunities there. But that's about the best I can offer you in terms of the evidence on these kind of things. And remember, enterprise zones were offering tax incentives, the ability to borrow over the longer term. They were wrapping in kind of planning reforms and capital allowances. So many of the things that we've kind of talked about that we would want the Freeports to do beyond the tariff and customs, they're in the enterprise zone model already.
Okay, thanks very much, Chair. You're on mute.
Well, there you go. I was just saying that Mark Menges is standing by and his microphone is soon to be unmuted. And there you go. I was hoisted high and won't petard there. Mark.
Thank you, Chairman. You on mute is one of the few times you talk a lot of sense. Question 5, and this is
thank you, Mr. Menges.
This is to everyone, but if I can start off with Andrew Carter. I mean, do you agree that Freeports can become hotbeds for innovation? And if so, what do you think the best way is to achieve that? So, hotbeds for innovation.
I would say, I'm not going to say they can't be hotbeds of innovation, but I would say that they are not hotbeds for innovation currently in the way that we would maybe want them to be. And therefore, we have to ask the question why. And when we think about the factors that drive innovation, particularly the location decisions that innovation firms make, what they are looking for is essentially two things. There is a longer list, but essentially two things tell us an awful lot. One, to be in close proximity to other innovation firms. Right, so innovation firms go where innovation firms are already. Now, that creates a very problematic situation. If you don't have innovation firms, difficult to get innovation firms. If you have some, you can build on them. So that's the first question. They go where innovation firms are already located. And unsurprisingly, when you look on the second factor, they go there in part so they can borrow from and interact with and learn from and trade with other innovation firms, but also it's because where innovation workers are, i.e. workers with the requisite skills in order to feed the innovation firm's needs in terms of where they currently are in expansion. Those two things, there's a cumulative process to that. So my question then is, if we want our ports to be innovation hotbeds, we need to think very carefully about both of those aspects. In a sense, can we create scale effect where innovation firms en masse are almost, located in that particular locality, and indeed innovation workers themselves are interested in going into those areas. Now, that may well be possible, but again, it seems to me, at least in many of our port areas, partly the reason they struggle and their port towns struggle is the absence of both of those attributes. They lack high-skilled workers and they lack high-skilled firms, and therefore innovation firms and innovation workers are going elsewhere.
And can I just, sorry, before we go on to that one, can I just ask, would a link to a university, for example, have a role to play?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, so I think, you have to think about how you can sort of artificially almost induce the connection to the innovation effect in the absence of it literally being there in that locality. And I'll give you an example. I can send the link through to the committee. We looked at the Advanced Manufacturing Research Centre in the Sheffield City region. And yes, it's a small facility. It's genuinely world-class, doesn't do production or very much, actually all in the testing, the piloting, the genuine R&D end of the manufacturing process. But one of the things, the attributes that has made that place a very, a success, albeit a very small success within Sheffield City region, is a very, very close relationship with, and actually it's been driven by the university pretty much from the outset. It's been physically located there, but it's also borrowed from the university's quite significant assets in and around this field. And then essentially it's been able to borrow and draw in the R&D aspects of Boeing, the R&D aspects of McLaren. So you induce it in the absence, because in the same way Sheffield City region is not bestowed with great pools of high-skilled labour and high-skilled innovation firms. It was many years ago, but not so much now. So you have to kind of try and induce that. My final point on that, when we did the study again, and this is important to remember, whilst the AMRC is a kind of jewel in the crown, it's primarily around innovation and productivity and kind of new material, new wealth. That's the contribution it's making. In terms of employment, 500 jobs, 600 jobs, it's not a vast employer of people in the patch, even though it has a fantastic apprenticeship program that draws in local people into that and allows them to develop careers. So again, thinking about the locality benefits versus the very big benefits, the national benefits, really quite important when you think about these sorts of things, particularly in the innovation sphere. Sorry, long answer.
No,
I hope that's useful.
That's brilliant, and Andrew, thank you. Kevin, over to you.
Well, I think there's a golden opportunity here where this could exactly happen. So we know that sectors cluster. You imagine if you had key manufacturers, I mentioned the green energy jobs, for instance, you put that together with not just universities, which is important, but also strategically placed colleges that could build campuses at these locations as well. I think that is a golden opportunity to bring in skills right on the doorstep of where they're required. And then you attract other people in. So if they have the enterprise zone incentives as well to go with that, then I think that's a really big golden opportunity. The key to all that, of course, is planning. And providing that planning is properly devolved to the areas that know that area best, i.e. your local authorities, I will keep mentioning it because that's where I'm from. Providing that happens, then absolutely you can start regenerating areas. That will, I think, if you start doing that, start to ripple out. We've seen that across the piece with current enterprise zones as well. There's no reason it shouldn't happen around Freeports. And I think that then brings in that pan-regional element, and that can then start spreading the wealth. There's a real opportunity if we free up the Freeports and let them become led by local people, local businesses, and local politicians.
That's great. And Richard?
Yes, I agree very much. I think one thing I would highlight on specific examples is the marine area and maritime. There's a huge amount of innovation and moves forward, whether it's be renewable energy generation or autonomous shipping, digitalisation of ports, or even blockchain in the logistics chain. You know, there's lots going on. There's innovation hubs. There's a new innovation hub at the Port of Tyne, which I think will feature if they indeed bid for Freeport status. Absolutely. And I think another thing that which builds on, I think, something that my colleagues were saying, is that if you can give some startup benefits, whether that be lower business rates and planning easements, etc., you're reducing the risks that investors and others have to take when you're developing your new startup, invariably in the innovation sphere. So I think that fits all very nicely with the Freeport model. But I think Andrew made a very good point. You have to balance that. You have to make sure that sort of traditional cargo activities and other things are also encouraged to flourish. And one final point I'll make about ports is, unlike certain other areas of the business and trade community, ports don't really move, you know, unless there's some huge generational economic change. Ports are there. You can trust that they're going to be in the same place, and they do have a vested interest in their community as a big infrastructure hub, usually indirect and direct employment, etc. So they do have a focal point that means I think they would be interested in working with educational institutions and others to look at skills and jobs, etc.
Richard, in order to really give a Freeport the best chance of becoming a hotbed for innovation, is there an argument for saying that you've got the actual Freeport itself is maybe, you know, in terms of its land and so on, so that is your primary site, but linked to it is maybe an airport, which is part of, so that's got a Freeport element, a Freeport dimension to it, and that's perhaps for your just-in-time, very high value added, product that sort of can come in, and it's kind of under that same umbrella, as the seaports, Freeports, where maybe the value added, the innovation or the manufacturing, whatever takes place. And then also linked to it would be your university, and then maybe again separate to that could be a skills centre or so on. So actually what we're talking about here is something that's actually much more than just a bit of land with a fence around it and a sign up that says Freeport. This is something that, it is actually multi-site potentially, but if you bring all those aspects together, you're really starting to give something that's got the impetus to become a game changer in terms of, the economics of this. I mean, what's your thoughts?
Well, that's certainly the vision we have, and I understand Andrew's had made some very sensible question mark points about that kind of vision and whether or not it'll actually achieve that. But I think with the right parameters, you're at least giving those ports and those regions and those people an opportunity to see whether they can make that succeed. And it's fair to say that ports on their own, without all this stimulus previously, have done a good, steady job of investing lots of money, private money, into infrastructure, employing people, keeping the country fed through normal times, including pandemics, etc. So just imagine what they can do if you were to perhaps unshackle them slightly further from regulation, and you provide some stimulus to support them, their tenants, and other people who want to come in, innovate and grow and develop.
That's good, Richard. Thanks. And Andrew, this one question is really specifically to you, and it's on that theme. So, I mean, does there need to be alignment between potential Freeport locations and the locations with potential to become growth centres? And that's really the areas identified by the Centre for Cities and for the government's, innovation objective to succeed.
I think we need to think about how that works in practice. But I think in some respects, different types of firms are already doing this. For example, I mean, we use this example a lot, and it's not to make pejorative points. It's just to illustrate, how we think about different things. Nissan makes its cars, or puts them together at least, in Sunderland, right? But it designs them in Cranfield and London. Why? Right? Because in Sunderland, well, historically it was given money to go there, but that's not the point. In Sunderland, it needs lots of land and relatively cheap labour, and it gets that. What it needs to design them, and the R&D function, is very, very high qualified, high innovative individuals that are not present in Sunderland in very great numbers, but they are plentiful in places like Cranfield and London. So the distribution, even within industries, is something that we should be very mindful about. And yes, we do think about agglomerative effects, from proximity, but all the evidence tells us agglomeration effects for manufacturing firms are massively lower than they are for services firms. Manufacturing firms get very, very few additional gains from being in close proximity to another manufacturing firm. The evidence is pretty clear on that, whereas services, industries and sectors benefit massively from being in close proximity to others. So I'm not, I'm not coming. I don't want to come across as being, these are all bar humbug. But we do need to be mindful about, and we do need to be at least understanding how these sort of systems currently work, and actually not lose sight of actually the benefits that some places have. Just as an aside, for example, I haven't looked at the numbers on this, but given the sort of the activities that are going on port industries, I would be mindful about, but this applies to not just to ports, it applies to more generally. We have a business rate system, for example, that penalises investment into plant and machinery. Right? Plant and machinery is actually is rateable valued by the valuation office. It actually retards investment into those kind of industries. I would assume, I don't know, but lots of the activity on ports is capital and machine kind of intensive. So rates of investment in those localities is going to be lower. We've also had a program, maybe not deliberately, where capital allowances essentially have shrunk over time relative to other opportunities. I would think very carefully about, if you're looking to induce more investment into areas that have more of these types of firms, I'd be thinking about those kind of interventions. Now, they'll benefit ports, not because we target ports, it's just that ports have more of these capital intensive firms that take advantage of it. Anyway, so enough from me. I can see the chair trying to wind me up, which is always good practice, Chair.
That's great. But I normally wind the chair up, Mr. Clark.
Very successfully.
So don't you worry. Great, that's it. That's wonderful. Thanks very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Menzies, for those fantastic questions, numerous fantastic questions. Can I just turn to Councillor Bentley now? And the government and planning is a huge area on the interaction there with Freeports. Do you think these will increase international trade? Are they going to displace it? And there's a tension there, of course, with the environment too. How do you see that as a councillor?
So I think it's very important that that is devolved properly and not just held centrally on that, because people who live in places know their places the best. The environment, of course, is an important question. I mentioned it right at the very start. So it is the knock-on effect past the port gates we have to think about, and what that does to the environment. So does everything have to come by lorry? Can we do a lot more by train, but need to invest in our rail services for that? Not so we shouldn't have lorries, we should. Or the different kind of lorries we're going to have in the future when we transport things around. Because clearly everything has to have the climate change ruler run through it. Well, I think it does anyway, and that's very important. So we mustn't lose sight of that by gaining one area, we lose in another, and actually quite dramatically lose in another if we're not careful. So that's why the planning, I think, has to be done on a regional basis and on a local basis, given the freedoms to do that. I talked about the education abilities to perform, what you can do, what we have done with enterprise zones thus far, what we can do with Freeports, I think is very important. So there is a challenge, but I think freedoms are allowed, should be allowed here, and that will allow those areas then to themselves compete on a global basis.
I mean, and the sellers, what we're getting at, my question is kind of, there are tensions that basically you come down on them, perhaps in your biases or your own particular needs, between environmental impact assessments, between birds and habitat regulations, between numerous things that are happening around the waterways, conservation, environmental designations that can be around as well. And then you've got the tension that a Freeport is there primarily to be a sort of an economic driver. And I'll move to Richard after I hear your view on this, Kevin. But the meshing of all those things is a really difficult call, because I mean the birds and habitat people, as I know, living in a rural area, kind of quite an effect on wind farms and what have you, that are usually wanted by people locally. So where do you see the balance falling from your own particular standpoint?
Yeah, sure. So you're right. It is difficult, but not impossible. We have built ports and very super ports as well in the UK.
You do them quickly though, with all those considerations.
Yes, exactly. And of course, we've had to work with environmental people and naturalists, and very, very important. We do that as well. So that's where the partnership work comes in, making sure that's done. And the best people who know that, of course, are the people on the ground locally making that happen. So none of this is impossible. It's how we do it and running that climate change ruler over it. Bearing in mind, we need ports. We've been a port trading nation for many centuries, haven't we? So it's how that is done and how that is managed, and what the legislation is that allows that to happen. But it is equally important that all sectors are a part of that conversation to come up with a solution. I'm a great believer, you put enough people around the table who are experts, you will get a solution. If you just stand there shouting at each other, you won't. So therefore, it needs to be controlled a little.
Thank you. Before I turn to Richard Ballantyne, I'll take in Matt Western, who's got a question around this area as well, and maybe Richard, you can put the two together from Matt Western coming in at this stage. Mr. Western.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, just really to you, Richard, just to pick up on this point really about permitted development rights, which we understand will be offered to all ports. So what will be the specific advantages in terms of planning? What will the advantages be for Freeports in this new era of permitted development?
Well, permitted development, as I said earlier, gives port authorities and others the ability to move forward with developments at a far quicker pace than in normal arrangements, notwithstanding Kevin's excellent planning colleagues who will want to facilitate planning applications as quickly as they possibly can. There have been some delays, I would probably say more so in the marine environment than the land side. But permitted development rights would give you that ability to respond quickly. And if you are trying to attract an overseas international inward investor, they understand things like planning processes, they understand permitted development at a very international level, and they see that as being very helpful for guaranteeing their investment so that their development can come off. So I think it's all about...
But does that not mean, sorry to cut across, but does that not mean that basically local communities will not have any say about what gets built on their quayside or in their port and what their portscape looks like?
Well, we have permitted development rights as is at the moment, so we've had them for many, many years, and it hasn't really led to particularly huge conflicts. There is local consultation. There are thresholds, of course, so we're not talking about sort of super projects being built here. But one or two of the things we're proposing brings the ports in line with airport operators who have a marginally more flexible arrangements. But also things like conservation zones, which the Chair mentioned, and marine protection and environmental conservation, of course. I would argue that it's very important. We're not talking about ripping up environmental rules here. We're working within the habitats regulations, but I think our strategic, as a country, our strategic view of where we put these designated sites hasn't been as joined up with our economic strategy as it could have been. And we've seen a lot of port locations, a lot of my members, about 70% of UK ports have a conservation zone within them, which then triggers things like additional assessments, impact assessments, monitoring, etc., that can really delay and add costs to development. So moving forward, I think those kind of designations, we need to be proper in thinking about where they should go. We've got lots of marine areas, lots of coastline, there's lots of room, lots of habitats. So there's room for everything, I would argue.
And just to come back to a point, if I could, Chair, just because there's been a lot of talk about sort of renewable energy investment and so on, which of course would be terrific. Some of us have been talking about it for many years. But the fact that trying to get investment, we want to compete with Scandinavia or certain European ports and so on. In Scandinavia, are there any free ports?
Not that I'm aware of particularly, not new ones anyway. There may be some legacy free ports that we've seen throughout the EU. I think there is still a handful, places like Riga and in the Czech Republic, there's quite a few sites, but not necessarily directly in Scandinavia.
Okay, thanks, Chair. You're on mute.
Am I committing the cardinal sin yet again of being muted? So that's shocking. After the lectures I give usually before these sessions, I've done it twice today. Anyway, Andrew Carter, can I just maybe question the environmental impacts, if any, and how the government's proposals for Freeports might have, and how the government could and should manage these clashes that will probably likely be happening. I mean, it depends where you stand here, really, in many ways. I mean, if you've got a pressing need to develop a Freeport, you might have a particular environmental view, and if you've got a pressing need not to, you might have another environmental view. Just is it a resources question?
And we certainly need the resources in order to, consider the different aspects. But both Kevin and Richard, I think, covered, the democratic element to it. I think is important in a sense. We need, that degree of legitimacy for, not just for ports, but actually for schemes that are done, particularly if there's, there's localized impact. But as Richard also said, we need to think about and trade off. I mean, that's really where we are. We're trying to, trade off the costs and benefits from doing, on one hand, environmental, on the other hand, kind of growth and development. That is the case not just in a Freeport context, but more generally across the piece. And I would say, nothing more than, in that, I think we do need to be as clear as we can as to what we think the costs are and what we think the benefits are, in a sense that better information and better understanding hopefully leads to better decisions, and actually all the players can better understand the trade-offs that may well be required, irrespective of where they come to the decision. And I think in some respects, I think part of the frustration or the disappointment you see in localities is that, for example, the benefits that have been promised to them don't materialize, but they do suffer some of the costs, that were also set out. So we just need to be a bit more open and a bit more mindful about that kind of conversation, I would suggest.
Thank you very much. I think this was us coming to the end of the first panel, and we're ready to move to the second panel. We've had quite an extensive time there. Can I thank those on the panel there just now, Richard, Kevin, and Andrew, for your time. Probably our paths will cross again at some other time. I've got a feeling, Kevin, they certainly will, at least, and Richard too. We might see you in Stornoway, so that would be.
Look forward to it.
Excellent.
Alex's leg is now better. He broke his ankle. He's now recovered. So.
I didn't know that. I hope it wasn't some event watching football, but I better not go down too down that road too much at all. We've got rival views on football teams, myself and Alex. But he's a great friend of mine. Guys, can I thank you very much for being here this afternoon, and then we'll move over to panel 2, who I hope are waiting by.
Thank you.
Our second panel shall be probably coming up quite soon. Unfortunately, we've lost Lars Carlson today at very short notice, so we've got a panel of 2 in front of us, and the panel are Anton Mosienko, who will correct my pronunciation, I hope, and Charlotte Morgan as well. Can I see either of them? Anton, I see there, and Charlotte too. Anton, can I ask you to introduce yourselves on your own terms, please? Name, rank, and serial number, as they say.
Thank you. Good afternoon. I'm Anton Moisenko, and this was one of the better attempts at the pronunciation of my name, so thanks for that. And I'm a research fellow at the Centre for Financial Crime and Security Studies at RUSI, which is a think tank in London, and together with my colleagues, I've been working on a project that examines risks of criminal activities in free ports around the world.
Thank you very much, and thanks for coming today. Charlotte.
Thank you, Chair, and hopefully you can hear me okay. I'm Charlotte Morgan. I'm a partner at Linklaters, international law firm, and I head up our trade practice, and we put in evidence to the committee around the implications for free ports in respect of international law, and in particular WTO law.
Thank you very much. Yes, we'll hear each other just fine as long as I don't, for a third time, commit the cardinal sin of not unmuting my mic if I do mute it. Can I ask you both, just to start, how do you assess the government's proposed customs procedures for free ports and how they differ from existing processes? Perhaps Charlotte, will start with you.
Yes, thank you, Chair. According to the government's consultation document itself, the proposed core customs and tariff benefits offered to businesses are around bringing goods into a free port site, and those really relate to duty suspension, duty inversion, and duty exemption for re-exports, and simplified customs procedures. So if I take those in turn, the first of those being duty suspension, the suggestion is that there be no tariffs or import VAT or excise to be paid on the goods which are brought into a free port from overseas until they leave the free port area and enter the UK domestic market. In terms of duty inversion is where the duty on the finished product is less than or lower than the sum of the duty of the components which are bought in order to make it. So if you were to set up a free port and you were to have a manufacturing facility on that free port, and you were bringing in products to use in your manufacturing facility, and you then were making a finished product and then exporting or bringing into the UK that finished product, then there could be a benefit between the arbitrage between the aggregate cost of the import duties and the cost of the finished duty. The finished product and the duty on that. So that is seen as a benefit. There is also then the simplified customs procedures which would apply, and government is intending to introduce streamlined procedures to enable businesses in terms of those businesses accessing free ports, and that does have a benefit as well.
Thank you very much. Anton, would you like to add anything in there?
My understanding is that the proposed customs arrangements are broadly in line with what you would see in many other free ports around the world. From my vantage point, one observation I would make is that it seems important to make sure that the suspension or not levying customs duties does not result in a domino effect whereby the overall quality of customs controls is adversely impacted. And in theory, these are two entirely unrelated questions, but the experience of a number of other countries suggests that if you don't have to levy customs duties in a free port, you have one less incentive to check which goods come into the country, specifically the free port, or leave the free port. And therefore, it is important to commit in principle that the overall quality of customs controls in a free port should be at least equivalent to that in the rest of the country's territory. And I'm sure that we will come back to the issues of how to achieve that in practice, but I think it's an important principle to bear in mind.
I mean, in your view or in your investigations, are the proposed procedures simple enough to attract businesses or whatever to UK free ports instead of going to international competitors, or even to move from international competitors at the moment? If this is a zero-sum game, if it's an attraction, if it's a competitive arena?
I'm not sure I'm qualified to answer this, so I will defer to Charlotte, if I may.
Charlotte, any thoughts on that?
I mean, in terms of what's in the consultation document at the moment, certainly the intention of the government is to make it attractive for inward investment. The devil will also always be in the detail of whether those are actually, whether there are actually simplified procedures and that those are really sufficiently attractive to bring in inward investment. There's obviously been sort of quite a lot of discussion already in your previous panel around, what it means for investment and whether it attracts new investment, which is obviously the aim, or whether it actually displaces other activities. So, but that's certainly the aim, but we won't know until we see more of the details around that.
Yeah, it might be a case of which Freeport has the least amount of devils that are carrying detail about. No particular reason for the segue at all, but I'm moving to Mark Menzies now. I think he's going to come in and continue.
I am.
In fact, I mentioned devils a second ago. I had no link at all, Mark.
Thank you, Chair. This is to Charlotte Morgan initially, and then over to Anton. Will government agencies require additional resources to administer these customs procedures? And if so, in which areas will these resources be required?
Thank you. I mean, in terms of the proposals, I think there's obviously going to be some additional work which is required in order to set up the Freeport in the first place, and in order to set up, from the point of view of authorising Freeport operators. So there will be some additional work which is associated with that. There'll also need to be checks on the businesses which want to operate within the Freeports. But after that initial administration, assuming that goes well and the administration is set up appropriately, then it's more a question really for HMRC as to whether they think there will be significant additional resource. And it will depend a lot around those administration procedures, the nature of them, how harmonised they are, and whether there are sort of a lot of additional activity which is required around that. One of the things that you do need to take into consideration, though, is because you're creating effectively a different customs regime within the Freeport, you will have to have security around the Freeport itself. So you will need to answer the sort of security questions which go with that, because what you don't want to find is that goods which are coming into the Freeport and not paying the customs duties as they come in, then leak out into the domestic, the wider domestic environment without having paid those tariffs. So you will need some kind of perimeter policing, and there may be additional security requirements around that, and how those are arranged could require additional resources. So in the sort of short term, obviously there is quite a lot to do with additional resources and setting it up. Once it's in operation, obviously that will go into more of a steady state, but we would expect some additional resources to be required.
Okay. And is any additional training that required for, in terms of for people to understand, particularly some of the legal aspects, the documentation that sits behind it, and how extensive is that going to be?
Yes, I mean you will. I mean, obviously the intention is that some of the procedures will be simplified, but there will need to be training, around the differences between the sort of two areas, as it were, and you will also, you will need to be trained on the records management system. I mean, the idea would be that you would have a records management system which was also capable of being accessed, remotely. So you will need to train staff on how to access those records, and also what the sort of rules and regulations are around that, when you can ask for information and what kind of information you can ask for. So yes, I would expect there to be some additional training requirements around that.
Okay, that's great. Thank you. And Anton, same question for yourself. Yeah.
I would echo Charlotte's comments, and I think that in addition to establishing Freeports and designating Freeport operators, it is also important to put in place arrangements for the monitoring of Freeport operators so that there is constant oversight over how well they're doing in fulfilling their responsibilities. That will obviously require a commitment of resources and expertise. In addition to this, a problem that has been observed in a number of other countries is that when they come back to their Freeport program and ask, okay, how well are we doing? And is there anything that we had not anticipated in terms of how Freeports operate? For example, are there any anomalous trading patterns that might be indicative of criminality? There is no good answer to that because nobody has been collecting relevant data or analyzing that data. And I think some sort of strategic data analysis capability, including as relates to crime prevention, but not necessarily only as relates to crime prevention, would also be extremely beneficial in this context.
And looking at the international comparison, Anton, the cost to the public purse is it greater than just the loss of tax revenue or tariff revenue that Freeport will generate? And how extensive is all these other costs to operate?
I would not be able to quantify the costs, but I think one of the important yet unquantifiable costs is the reputational issue that might arise if things go badly wrong. And there are free ports around the world that have been known for illicit trade and consequent problems in the international relations between states that host those free ports and other countries. And that is something that is, as I say, impossible to quantify, but nonetheless important, because you want to reap the economic benefits of a free port, but you don't want to have to constantly justify yourself in relation to what is happening in those free ports. And indeed, we don't have to look far afield to see examples of that issue. For example, the EU famously is now in doubt over the future of any remaining free ports in the EU. So I think certainly those issues are something that should be very much part and parcel of the cost-benefit calculation.
Okay, that's great. Thank you very much, both of you. Thank you.
Just 2 points to pick up on, Anton. Firstly, that the EU are in doubt of the need for the maintenance or the remaining free ports continuing. Is that because they're sort of dying on the vine the way the UK once did up to 2012? Basically, I'm asking what's the reasoning behind that?
So the stated rationale is the report that the European Union commissioned on tax evasion risks in free ports. And I have to preface this by saying that the risk that they were considering is very peculiar to the way that certain free ports operate, namely high-value storage. And I'm sure that the committee has heard about the issue of high-value storage before and doubts over whether the UK should allow any sort of high-value storage. But there the concern is mostly about tax evasion, and that has been the stated reason for the European Parliament to call for the urgent abolition of the system of free ports in the EU. Whether there were any other economic considerations that might have fed into that decision, I'm not aware of.
Thank you very much. And Charlotte, as our learning grows around this area, and sort of we think of other aspects of it, if you're trading in a free port and you're importing goods tariff-free, but there are some goods in some part of the world, let's say they've got anti-dumping tariffs or duties on them, how does the free port then react? So you might have a free port in Martin Vickers' area in Cleethorpes there, and then you've got some product coming in that's got a wider anti-dumping duty. How does the free port react with those when the state involved has got wider duties on it? And then would there be an advantage in the free port? I mean, explain that one for us.
So, in respect of the in respect of goods coming into the free port, they are coming in on when they come in, then there will be benefits to them in terms of the tariffs which are being applied to them within the free port, and it's only once they come into the domestic arena that they become subject to the incoming tariffs in respect of that. So, if from a customs perspective, although you've got one geographical area, you have these two different customs areas. So they are treated differently in that respect. On the sort of kind of wider question of anti-dumping requirements, that would be a more of an issue in respect of trade remedies and the aspects which are associated with that, rather than specifically on the customs side. Okay, so
you're doing something with ceramics. Let's say you could get Chinese ceramics being dumped more cheaply than you could from down the road in Stoke. Would you?
Well, what's happening in the free port is that it's not until the product actually comes into the domestic regime that the tariffs would apply in that respect.
Okay, so it should sort of self-correct, and that you'd then be aware that
once it comes into the UK, yeah.
Yeah, thank you very much. So thanks for clarifying that. I want to move now to Mark Hendricks. So Mark Hendricks, who's waiting patiently by. Mark.
Thanks, Chair. Can I start by asking Charlotte and Anton to come in if he wishes to do so? What does the government need to consider to ensure that its customs and tax measures for free ports are compatible with the UK's obligation under the World Trade Organization's agreements?
Thank you for that. I think, first of all, it's really important to remember, as I was just alluding to, that the starting point is that the UK WTO obligations apply to its whole territory. So although you've got these different customs territories with the sort of kind of the rest of the UK and then the Freeports, the actual WTO obligations apply right across the board, regardless of those two separate issues, those two separate zones, which is purely a domestic issue. Now, the main WTO obligations which are relevant to Freeports really arise around the rules on subsidies and to a slightly lesser degree the rules around non-discrimination. So the main issue to think about is around subsidies, and those are governed by the WTO's agreement on subsidies and countervailing measures. And that applies to industrial goods. So it applies to things which are being imported and in respect of industrial goods. Now, under that agreement, the UK isn't permitted to subsidise either particular companies or particular industries or relevantly geographical reasons if it has an anti-competitive effect on foreign products. That's very similar. The sort of subsidies regime is very similar in a lot of ways to the EU state aid rules, but the main difference being that the EU state aid rules assume an anti-competitive effect, whereas this needs to be actually shown and proven in the WTO. So not every incentive that you might be offering in a Freeport, not every incentive itself will be a subsidy. You will need to look at whether it is in fact a subsidy, and then you will need to go further and look at whether that subsidy is a prohibited subsidy or whether that subsidy is a permitted subsidy. And when you're looking at whether something is permitted or whether it's permitted subsidy or not, you are looking at a number of different factors. So firstly, there are some subsidies which are prohibited. So a subsidy which is contingent upon exports, in other words, something which is designed to promote exports and has the effect of promoting exports itself, could be seen as prohibited. If a subsidy is contingent on the use of domestic input products over imported products, so discrimination, then that will also be potentially illegal. And the subsidy which has anti-competitive effects, which is again something which needs to be demonstrated, but if it has anti-competitive effects, that could also be seen to be illegal. So one of the main things that you'll need to look at, and we'll need to look at in a lot more detail, is when you're looking at any regime that the government puts in place, it will need to have an eye to those subsidy requirements.
Okay, Anton, would you like to add anything to that?
No, this is far beyond the area of my expertise, but thanks for the opportunity.
Okay, well, tied in with that, how do you think the government's Freeport proposals sit within the government's overall strategy? And how could the UK's obligations under new free trade agreements impact Freeports in the UK? Charlotte, let's try that one.
So in terms of the UK's wider trade strategy, that's sort of more of an economic question than a legal question per se. So I probably won't comment so much on that, but I can sort of pick up the question around sort of how it impacts on for example free trade agreements, and obviously the government's in the process of negotiating a number of free trade agreements around the world at the moment. So it does Freeports do, and the subsidies regime in particular does have some implications around that. So at the moment, sort of, if you like, traditional EU third country FTAs do incorporate by reference the WTO subsidies rules, which I was just referring to. So a lot of them do incorporate those rules. And they also go further and they do add to those rules. So for example, in the most recent cases, the EU and Korea and EU Japan FTA, they also add additional. They go beyond. They go beyond the sort of the SCM itself, and they add some new obligations, particularly around a prohibition on subsidies which affect trade of two types, and that includes where those subsidies cover debts or liability of specific enterprises for an unlimited sum or an unlimited duration, and where there are subsidies to insolvent and ailing enterprises.
Charlotte, could I pause you just a moment? I know that
sure.
Mad Western has got a division, and the members on the estate are off to a division. Mad Western, how long is the division, and do you think, members, I'm in your hands, should we continue or pause at the moment because of the division? Matt, Paul, are you both on the estate?
It's up to you, Chair. There was a problem with the system yesterday, but we should be through in about 15 minutes. So if you can hang on for 15 minutes to carry on, or you guys, whoever's left, just run through the outstanding. There's only a few outstanding issues.
Are we still quorum?
Yeah, we are. I think, Paul, are you on the estate, or are you? No, you're in Northern Ireland.
Okay. So
okay, we'll carry on, Matt. If that's
leave you to it. Thanks very much.
Okay, that's fine. Apologies for cutting you off midstream, Charlotte. I just need to know what's going on at Westminster.
No, completely understood, Chair. Thank you.
Thank you.
Would you like me to carry on? Or?
Yeah,
yes.
I think that's a consensus we've got. Yeah, I'm seeing nods about it. Thank you.
Not at all. The other thing is that some of the EU FTAs do extend the subsidies regime and rules to services, which is something which is also important and interesting. But other countries haven't yet followed the practice of extending these prohibited subsidies into their FTAs in the same way. However, it might be expected that following the 2020 joint trilateral statement of the EU, US and Japan, which agreed an approach of adopting the EU's approach more widely, that we could begin to see those beginning to have impacts on the FTAs which we negotiate around the world as well.
Thank you very much. Mark Hendrick, are you finished there? Are you more to go?
Well, I was going to ask a little bit,
okay,
to be controversial, about what Charlotte thinks about what the government's hinted at in terms of its possible future use of state aids and its contravention, seemingly, with the Withdrawal Act and where we're headed from here. I don't know if she wants to contact on that.
That's not something that I've specifically looked at, I'm afraid. So I know that there's a new bill being put forward, but it's not something I've looked at in any detail. So I'm afraid I'm not able to comment today on that.
I've not looked at the contents of the bill. I don't know if you have, Angus, but it does seem to impact on the discussion we're having in this committee at the moment.
I think, like many ministers at the dispatch box, it's one we're going to have to body swear at the moment. It's probably best for the witnesses too. I don't think it's a specialised area. If we can move on after you did say controversially, and you were right. It was a controversial opening. Just to pick up where Matt Western was to Anton Mazienko. I mean, how significant is the risk to Freeport from illicit activity? And which type of activities are of most concern, do you feel, Anton?
I think first I should make it clear that the label of a Freeport itself does not magically open the door to all sorts of crimes. So whether you call an area Freeport or not is of secondary relevance. But okay, there is evidence internationally that Freeports tend to be associated with elevated risks of criminal activities for the simple reason that if you have less of an incentive to collect customs duties, as I have alluded to, there can be less of a reason to have robust customs controls. And also the hallmarks of a successful Freeport is the large volume of trade and diversity of trading routes. So the specific types of criminal activity that you might face as a Freeport would include all sorts of illicit trade, from drugs to counterfeits to the illegal wildlife trade. There would also be a risk of smuggling that Charlotte has alluded to, as well as the risk of leaking of goods into the domestic economy from the free port. And finally, perhaps more esoterically, there is some possibility of what is known as trade-based money laundering, the use of trade by organized criminal groups to move value internationally. And there has been analysis published by the World Customs Organization based on data of more than 600 seizures related to free ports around the world that bears out the existence of all those risks.
Oh, why does that happen at free ports? Is it just because there's less eyes running about keeping an eye on what's going on, or do people just feel there's a different culture at the free ports, or what?
Both of these. So it's reduced incentives, it's the culture that is focused on trade facilitation, and also in a number of countries, there is a risk that if the free port is a transshipment hub, then you don't have a skin in the game, because the goods would come from a different country, they would be en route to a different country, and you would be merely one stage in the long and quite convoluted logistical process, which means that there is an open question as to the responsibility of transshipment hubs in relation to preventing illicit trade that touches on them, but does not necessarily directly implicate their own interests.
And just before I come Charlotte, sorry Charlotte, you want to come in?
No, I was just going to say, I mean, just to sort of build on what Anton's been talking about. I mean, the government's Freeport consultation paper does also refer to this, and also notes that the 5th anti-money laundering directive has now been implemented into English law. It became effective on the 10th of January this year, and that does include a number of changes which are designed to sort of help in this area. Freeport operators are now AML gatekeepers, which means they're obliged to report suspicious transactions which are to designated financial intelligence units. Freeport operators are also designated as non-financial obliged entities and subject to the same sort of customer due diligence requirements as for example, other parties are. And because they're designated as obliged entities under that directive, the DAC 5 framework will start applying to them, meaning that the tax authorities are entitled to access on request to the ultimate beneficial owner information which is held by those Freeport operators. So it has been an acknowledged issue. It was an acknowledged issue in the EU report in 2018, which looked at money laundering and tax evasion in free ports. And some of these aspects are designed to try and mitigate some of those elements. I think there is a recognition, even in the EU report, that it won't completely eliminate it, but the intention is to mitigate some of those effects that Anton's been referring to.
I hear what you're saying there. And do you think, given all that and what you've been talking about, both of you, should the government require free ports to adhere to the OECD's Code of Conduct for clean free trade zones? I mean, is that something that I would imagine it's a yes there, but I'm just checking that. Charlotte?
I think that would probably be a yes. Yeah.
Anton?
Yes, that's a yes from me as well. And I would say that if we forgot about the Code of Conduct and just had a clean slate in front of us and tried to draw up a list of recommendations on how to prevent crime in free ports, we'd probably end up having something remarkably similar to the Code of Conduct. So it's only common sense, really.
So it's a strong yes for that. I mean, on the other side, what might people argue against or use as arguments against complying with that Code of Conduct? If you were to be devil's advocates on this, one or either of you. There's not an argument, is what you're saying?
There's not an argument that immediately springs to my mind. I maybe could give it some more thought, but at the moment I would say it's probably a good idea.
Fair enough, thank you. Dr. Masienko, we've heard evidence that the government should ban the use of free ports for high-value storage. Is such a ban firstly necessary, and if so, what benefit would it offer? And also, could such a ban disadvantage UK free ports in attracting international trade? Your views, sir?
My feeling is that there are other ways of mitigating the risks than outright ban, And I think that risks of tax evasion in free ports in relation to high-value storage are at their highest if, first of all, the UK does not tax the sale of goods that are being stored in a free port, and secondly, there is no way for tax authorities in other countries to know what is being stored in UK free ports. So if you tackle either of these two facets of the problem, I think it's possible to make significant progress. So either apply the same tax regime to free ports as in the rest of the country, or make sure that you have proper information sharing pathways in place. And as Charlotte has explained, some progress has been made in relation to the money laundering regulations that now designate art intermediaries in free ports as regulated entities. But there is no guarantee that action will be taken once an art intermediary submits a suspicious activity report. So I think much more thought should be given to the way of sharing information about the contents of UK free ports, for lack of a better term, with other countries.
Charlotte, anything to add there? Are you happy enough for that answer?
No, I think Anton's answered that very adequately. The main thing is around making sure that we implement, or we have implemented the directive, and that does mitigate it. It doesn't completely, rule it out, but as Anton says, that you've got to, obviously, if you do put in place an absolute ban on high-value goods, that is effective, but it may have other implications. So if you can do more around gathering information, that may mitigate the effect.
Thank you very much. I'm now going to turn to Paul Girvan, my neighbour almost directly to the south. Mr. Girvan.
Good man. Thank you, Chair. This is to Charlotte. Is it clear who will have overall responsibility for the oversight and monitoring of free ports established in the UK?
The consultation document itself, as it's presented to Parliament by the Chief Secretary to the Treasury, does and was signed as well by the Secretary of State for International Trade, the Secretary of State for Housing, Communities and Local Government, and the Secretary of State for Transport. And that probably in itself provides an indication of the level of cross-governmental and departmental involvement in the free ports and in the proposed models. I think your earlier panel gave lots of sort of kind of good evidence around the sort of types of things that we're looking at. We're looking at customs, border control, education, the link in with universities and skills and training, trade aspects, transport, environment we touched on as well, and also Councillor Bentley also was talking about the importance of having local governments involved. And when you've got that many different organisations and different government departments and local governments, being involved in the success of a free port, then it is important to sort of kind of understand how all of those government authorities and departments and local governments will actually coordinate together. And that's something which obviously the consultation document doesn't specifically give an answer to, but it is something that will need to be thought through if you really want to make a sort of huge success of this, which I know the government does.
Thank you, Charlotte, for that answer. And in answering it, it has probably raised another question in relation to the number of different bodies that feel they might have responsibility or have some involvement in this. Is there a need for government to establish an oversight body to coordinate between all of the relevant people who feel their responsibility to ensure that there is that oversight from a government perspective?
I mean, I suppose the question of an oversight committee or whether you just designate one of the departments, if you like, as having the lead for responsibility for coordination, I think there are sort of pros and cons of both approach. But I think that there is, I do think that there's some benefit in thinking about how you do coordinate all of those activities to make sure everything is working well and working in concert, and also making sure that nothing falls between the cracks, that somebody doesn't think someone else is doing something that they should do. I think there's also some evidence, and you see this a little bit in sort of the kind of new towns sort of work which has been done, particularly in the planning space, where actually if you can create, if you can create something which has a little bit more of a sort of its own sort of entity itself, it can also become a huge advocate for Freeports more generally. So it can also perform an advocacy role as well as a sort of as well as an oversight and monitoring and also a coordination role. It can also provide that sort of outreach and advocacy for Freeports, which if you think about them in terms of their impact on international trade, that could be a very useful additional function that they could perform. But I don't think you have to do it. I think there are pros and cons of doing it. But I think one of the big pros would be this sort of outreach function, although that equally could, I suppose, be done by the Department for International Trade.
I take it from that there's probably merit in having an oversight body set up. I'm just asking you, and maybe Anton can come in on this, what are the benefits, what benefits would this offer, and on what legislative basis should this be established?
So if you did go down that rule, then if you did go down that road, then you probably would need some kind of statutory framework to do that, to sort of to bring it all together. And as I said, there are models, for example, in the new towns legislation, which again brings together local communities and different government departments in terms of the structuring for that. So there are some precedents out there which one could draw on, but again, it's more of a question for government than for me.
Appreciate that. Anton, have you any views on that?
It strikes me that Freeports involve a lot of activities that are quite disparate, in the sense that someone has to ascertain the economic benefits of establishing a Freeport and designate a Freeport operator. You also need to conduct a criminal risk assessment, in my view, that would involve coordination with HMRC, Border Force and other relevant law enforcement agencies. You need someone to explain to Freeport operators what they're expected to be doing day to day. Someone has to monitor compliance. There is also value in strategic analysis of data related to the operation of Freeports. So it seems to me there is a whole mix of things that seem to be necessary or desirable, and whether those different disparate activities are best undertaken by a special designated body that would look at all things Freeports, or whether they can be usefully scattered across different existing bodies, as it were, seems to me to be very much an open question. I don't have a ready answer for this, but I think it's this kind of instrumental approach that I would take, of listing all the activities and then trying to fit them into the existing picture and seeing if that makes sense at all.
Thank you. Thank you.
I certainly, just to add on that, I certainly think that mapping exercise of making sure nothing falls through the cracks and that each of those activities is being monitored by one or other of the government departments with accountability is a really good idea.
Thank you. We're coming near just about to the end, but there's just two additional questions I'd like to ask you both. Firstly, I mean, everything's up in the air in the UK as we see from utterances from the dispatch box on almost a surprising basis. But anyway, imagine that the UK ran very low tariffs, or indeed it's managed to strike an agreement, however it might seem unlikely in this hour, it might seem likely the next hour, but if it struck an agreement with the European Union to have things in harmony and concert and that there were no tariffs, I mean, would that undermine and kick away the need for Freeports?
Not in and of itself. I mean, I think where the UK government ends up on tariffs in a number of different arrangements which it has under its free trade agreements does have a relevance, because you're looking at so it has a particular relevance around the duty inversion that I was talking about previously. So it will have an impact on those trading relationships, but I don't think that would do away the rationale or the benefit that can be obtained from Freeports, because you are looking at something which is of its nature, very global. So you are looking at attracting those imports from a number of different regions, some of which may have free trade agreements and some of which may not.
Thank you. Anton, any view?
I would second that, and I will not use the phrase Singapore on the Thames, but Singapore is an interesting international comparator because it does have very low or indeed non-existent duties on the majority of products, yet it also has a number of free ports. So even though the country itself can be seen as one big free port, that has not reduced the perceived benefit of having a number of free ports around the country. And I suspect that that has to do as much with logistical benefits and the infrastructure that the previous panel has discussed in detail as other benefits.
I think I wasn't sure it was Singapore on the Thames or Singapore on the Tyne. Of course, that's part of the tension at the heart of the Freeport issue. Now, something else I suspected with the other committee, I mean, the whole enthusiasm for Freeports may not be for Freeports per se, but more for the benefits that the government might be throwing in with the Freeports deal. Any particular views on that? Is that what's really driving the enthusiasm for Freeports rather than the strict discipline there is to sort of the Freeport itself, or is that question just far too speculative to tackle for either witness?
That's more of a policy question than a legal question from my perspective. So I mean, I think the only thing that that I would add is, you know, when you are throwing in these additional benefits, you do need to look back to the subsidies regime, which I was talking about earlier, and making sure that you're staying the right side of the line on that.
Thank you. Anton.
Nothing to add from me on this one. Thank you.
That's great. Okay, thank you very much for helping us gather evidence today for this inquiry into Freeports, our second session. Pair of quality witnesses there, I'm sure everybody will agree, and a very good quality first panel as well. My correction earlier in the day, it isn't actually Gibraltar National Day till tomorrow, so we can be ready for that tomorrow. It's indeed Catalan National Day today, so it's somebody else in the Iberian Peninsula that is having their national day. Can I thank the panel, or second panel, for coming along? I really appreciated your time this afternoon, and I had a lovely afternoon here in the Outer Hebrides, so I'm glad to say the time is up, and order, Fescama.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.